Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Sana Rizvi. A lot of you know me from, I don't know, various networks. I'm a lecturer at University of Exeter, and today we are very excited to start off with the first Reen event. Reen stands for Race, Ethnicity, and Education Network, which is run by wonderful members such as Malcolm Richards. You'll see he's handling all the tech inquiries here. Helen Noller, myself, Riyadh, and I think Ruth might be joining us. So I'm very excited today about the talk today because we're inviting someone who's not based in educational research. And Reen is very good with getting people from different fields, different networks, academics, activists from different disciplines, and sort of making, because all of this is very important to the education field. So today we've invited Associate Professor Sabah Fatma. She's a professor of philosophy at Southern Illinois University, USA, and she teaches feminist theory, philosophy of race. She teaches Islam and politics, world religions, reasoning, argumentation. Her research interests are with dealing with non-ideal theory, social and political within prescriptive Islam, feminist and race theory, and ethics and medical humanities. I hope I've covered that bit, Sabah, accurately. And I think I'll state the obvious here. I'm also super excited because Sabah is my sister. And you can guess which one, whether she's the elder one or whether she's younger than me. But anyways, so
I'm the older one.
No, anyways, so I'm really excited to have this talk because we have these conversations anyways, in whenever we chat. And I thought we could all benefit from having a collaboration between different disciplines. So today's talk is about epistemic harms of microaggression. And I'll get straight down to it. And Sabah has written papers on this. And I'm going to start with a very, very simple question because I need to understand it from the start. So my first question, Sabah, is what is microaggression and what is the big deal?
So microaggressions, I know a lot of you probably know a lot about microaggressions, but I'll just give like a very basic definition. Microaggressions are like the everyday, subtle, and intentional, but oftentimes unintentional interactions that communicate some sort of bias towards those that are historically marginalized. So a microaggressive incident, whether it's verbal or not, doesn't have to be verbal. It's harmful because it's not simply an insult, but rather it's harmful because it fits into a larger system of domination. And somebody who's very well intentioned could say or do something that is microaggressive, and they may not be consciously doing it. But intent here doesn't matter because their singular act fits into this larger pattern of racist or sexist or ableist, transphobic structures and histories of our society.
Okay. Can you give us an example of how microaggression or what microaggression looked like in higher education?
So I'll refer everyone to this great article that was, I think it's a 2014 article by Stacey Patton, who is an American journalist, writer, and a college professor in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And she has like these examples of some microaggressive acts within academia. So for example, a white faculty interviewing for a job saying at an HBCU, which is a historically Black college, saying, I want to teach in an urban setting because I want to make a real difference, which is basically saying, I want to save little brown people and feel good about myself. Or a white woman student saying to a Black woman classmate, oh, you're such a strong person. I could never express myself in this way. Which is basically saying you don't express yourself in the appropriate ways because there are tropes of Black women as being angry or hostile, or a professor to a biracial colleague saying, we need some real diversity in this department, saying, we need some Black people. Or a chair of a hiring committee to a Black female candidate, so tell me how would you handle when you're angry? How would you handle an angry situation? Again, relying on tropes. Or your student evaluations, where somebody writes in your eval, this professor takes herself too seriously, and takes her subject matter too seriously, right? Again, I'm sure some of you might have seen comments like that in your evaluation, especially if you are a woman academic or a junior academic, implying that how dare we take ourselves as intellectuals or as academics. And those are just some examples. I'm sure all of you have many others that have happened in your life.
Okay, so this is when you say epistemic harms of microaggression, now when the term epistemic comes, a lot of people are like, oh my God, this is a very loaded term. What does that mean? So what do you mean specifically by epistemic harms of microaggression?
I'll give a super simple definition. Epistemology is just the study of knowledge. So epistemic harm simply means the wrongs that result from being microaggressed, that diminish the person's capacity as a knower. So something happens to you and that diminishes your capacity as a knower, or as a person who can generate and participate in making knowledge claims. That's the simplest, I think.
So, for example, if someone has experienced microaggression and I'm relaying it to someone, but people are denying that it's an act of microaggression, I'm making a very simple analogy over here. That is denying my knowledge experience of it. Is that what it is?
That would be one form. That'd be one epistemic harm of microaggression. So, for example, something microaggressive happens to you. You say that it happened to you, and then somebody says, "Well, some things like that happen to me all the time as well." Or this happens to all of us, and you know that what happened to you was a function of your identity, or function of the social group, the marginalized social group that you belong to, and it is not simply a disgruntled student. So one of the examples that I think I used initially in one of my writings was, and that's how this entire project started actually, was there was a student, and there was a student of mine from a class, and she was studying in the library, and I was walking through the library, and she was studying with somebody else in that library, and the person that she was studying with didn't know that I was her TA. Okay. And so she you know she, she calls over to me. I say, oh, like, hey, how are you doing? Like, we're very far from each other right now. And I say, hey, how's it going? They're like, oh, just nervous about the exam. And I say something like, oh, I just got to look at it actually, because I just met the professor upstairs, and I said, I just got to look at it recently. I just got to look at it, and don't worry, it's not that hard. And then this other student, she perks up, and she calls me over, like, she says, hey, like, I don't even know how to describe her hey to me. It was like hey, like, I can't replicate it. Just, I don't know why, but my whole body just heated up, and I started like, I started like feeling myself super hot, feeling sweaty and very uncomfortable. And then the student said to the other my student said to her friend, oh, she's my TA. And that was the end. And then I left, and I was thinking, what just happened? Like, why did I feel like that? Why did that student also respond like that? And I think it might be because she thought I was the janitor, I was the cleaner for the office who had gotten a look at the exam. And the student who was the person who was my student immediately got that sense that she wasn't calling to me as a TA. She wasn't calling to me as a professor. She was calling to me the way that she would call to somebody who's socially inferior to her. And so she immediately corrected her friend, said, look, that's my TA, And when I relate this incident back to people who are white, their response was often like, well, that's probably because you look so young, or that's probably because she thought you were a student, or something along those lines. And that would be one form of epistemic harm, Sana, that you just said, which is that they were undercutting the way that I was articulating my experience of what just happened.
Right.
But when I relayed that experience to other people of color, they were like, yep, been there. Like, where students assume that you are the cleaning staff, or you're just another, somebody else, not the person in authority. But almost everybody who's white pushes back on my interpretation of my own experience, my ability to make claims about my own experience, to make knowledge claims about what happened to me. Are you sure that's what happened? Are you sure? I don't think that. Yeah, I mean, I think you're kind of like overthinking this. Maybe you're being a little
Yeah.
bit paranoid, and
So
so
that's interesting.
that's a form of one form of epistemic harm.
I'm gonna come back to the pushback that white people, that you face when you talk about microaggressions at a later point. But for now, can you tell me? So in your paper, you talk about what is a primary epistemic harm and what is a secondary epistemic harm. What do you mean by this?
So the primary epistemic harm is basically the most direct harm to the microaggressed, the direct epistemic harm to the microaggressed of the microaggression. So let's take an example. You're walking down the hall, and the campus security. I don't know how it is in England, but here we have campus security, and the campus security, on our campus, the campus security also carries guns, which is weird. But anyways, the campus security calls you from down the hall and says, "Excuse me, miss, there are only faculty offices down this hall," right? Or that area is only for faculty, right? Um, Obviously, what they're saying to you is, "Stop, you're trespassing," right? So so the primary epistemic harm would be like you start thinking to yourself, why did this person say this? Like, does he say this to everyone who passes this hallway? Do I not look professional enough to be a faculty member? Did they say it because I'm a person of color? So it is within these initial sentiments that there's the primary epistemic harm occurring, because the recipient, namely that faculty member, is unable to be sure how to even process or generate claims about what happened to them, about their own experiences. And this is like prior to them even sharing it with anybody. This is just in themselves. They're trying to figure out like what just happened. Um, and they feel uneasy, and they're unable to develop this certainty about the nature of the experience that is occurring. And this is mostly because sometimes when you're going through the experience, it is difficult to recognize certain patterns of disrespect that are motivated by racism or sexism or xenophobia. Because in that moment, you're not thinking, oh, let me see if this fits a pattern. I mean, if it happens to you often enough, you'll eventually know that it's the pattern. But if it's, your first day at your job and it's happening, you want to give other people the benefit of doubt. And so um, you can't be certain. You can't develop epistemic certainty about what happened. And that failure to make knowledge claims to your own self, um, and um, the link between how you felt, like I felt embarrassed, I felt heated up, right? And systemic oppression, that's that's not an easy task. And so that itself is a direct epistemic harm of microaggression, my ability to make that knowledge claim with epistemic certainty about my uncomfortable experience.
So when people talk about, I'm going to go slightly back. I should have asked this first. So microaggression, I'm just coming to clarify terms. Is it judged by the impact or by the intention?
By the impact. Almost most things race related should not be judged by intention. Intention is rarely relevant. Um, I mean, there's so much research done on unconscious bias, first of all. And we all grow up in a system where we all have, we all grow up with certain norms around us, right? And so we have all sort of the American expression, we've all sort of drunk the Kool-Aid, right, of racism and sexism and transphobia and ableism, right? We've all drunk that Kool-Aid. So I might say I'm anti-racist, but I still might be doing racist crap. Like I still might be acting in microaggressive ways or doing overt racist actions, and not recognize it as such. And I mean, you can go into why I have so much epistemic certainty that I'm not a racist. You can go into that, but I think that'd be kind of veering off into it. But the short answer is that people oftentimes have epistemic certainty about them not being racist or not them having good intentions, is because the norms around them tell them that it's okay to act like that, to say those things, and to enforce those norms. So you say to the police officer, you say, why did you say that to her? And they'll say, I'm just doing my job. Would you have said that to a white female faculty member? I would have. They would say, yes, I would have. And they maybe even mean it when you ask them that question. But it's not relevant. It's not relevant on what they believe in their own head. Because there are plenty of statistics that are out there about how people of color are treated different from white people, or able-bodied people are treated different from people with disabilities, right? So intent becomes not as relevant. I think what is more relevant is the systems of oppression that we live under and how to counter those systems of oppression.
Okay, that helps clarify a lot of things, and perhaps future questions that come your way. So what is secondary epistemic harm?
So the secondary epistemic harm would be the epistemic harm that comes in the aftermath of the initial microaggression, when people around the microaggressed often cannot or do not see what happened as microaggression. So I differentiate between two types of epistemic harms, two types of secondary epistemic harms. And the first form is gaslighting. And that's the example, Sana, that you had mentioned earlier, right? So and I'm sure a lot of you have had that experience where, imagine you're in a faculty meeting, right? And for my particular example, I'm in an all-white faculty meeting, and I'm the only person of color, and somebody who's generally well liked in your department is quite, a friendly person for all other purposes. Everybody likes this person. They're not a jerk, and there's no ill feelings towards this human being. They make a comment that's kind of offhand, and and they say something like, well, they say, students of color, or they say black students, or they say international students. Pick your group, marginalized group, but they say, students of color generally, they don't have the skills to get into top graduate schools, right? And so even though that comment is directed at students of color, because you're the sole person of color in that meeting, and from your previous experiences that this is basically code for people of color don't really belong in academia or in the ivory tower or in big name Ivy schools, right? So you decide to speak up and you say something, and you say, well, how much of this is our failure? What stats do you have to back up your claims? And, has there been a longitudinal study done? Are you speaking out of your, So not only does no one recognize what just happened as a microaggression, because nobody else said anything, did anything, changed the expression, nothing. But on top of that, like two white ladies from your department now chime in to say like, hey, why do you got to make everything about race, right? Or you should try to be more respectful in the way that we communicate. We should all try to be more respectful in the way that we communicate with each other, which is basically saying that you were just disrespectful for pointing out something microaggressive that just happened, right? And so now we're not only dealing with the impact of the direct epistemic harm, do students of color not belong or don't have the proper academic skills and so on and so forth. You're dealing with knowledge claims regarding that claim, but now you're also dealing with this attempted gaslighting, where two white faculty members are undercutting the reality that you just perceived, right? So the second form of epistemic, the second form, so that was the first form. So the first form is gaslighting, right? That happens in the aftermath. The second form of the secondary epistemic harm of microaggression is what I term here is like the absence of cumulative epistemic resources. So the absence of shared cumulative epistemic resources that impede our ability to make knowledge claims about our experiences to others. And so there's I mean, there are lots of philosophers who write about epistemic harms and about epistemic injustice. And so one of them, Miranda Fricker, in her book Epistemic Injustice, she talks about hermeneutical injustice, and she says this occurs when experiences are obscured from our collective understanding because of unequal social relationships, right? And so actually, I found Audrey Yap's article about sexual assault, like a better example on how to explain this this hermeneutical injustice, or like this lack of shared epistemic resources. I should have read it more carefully before this talk because it just came in my head right now. But a lot of times, heads up, just a bit about sexual assault, but like a lot of times when somebody is sexually assaulted, we have kind of narratives in our head about people whose testimony we are going to believe. And because those are the narratives that kind of surround us. And when somebody who doesn't fit those narratives says something, we don't give them our epistemic trust. We don't trust their testimony, right? And so so similarly, in the case of microaggression, I'm going to come back to microaggression now. Similarly, in the case of microaggression, what happens is that there's a disadvantage in how you can communicate what just happened to you, because those narratives are not surrounding us, that this is an act of microaggression, or this fits into racial oppression. That when you make a statement like students of color don't have competent academic skills, this fits into racial oppression. We may not be surrounded by those sorts of narratives that this is a racist comment to make, right? And because we're not surrounded by that narrative, in my particular example, as an able-bodied person, I don't see my comment as ableist. And I don't trust you when you tell me that I've made an ableist comment.
Right.
Like, I'm like, no, it wasn't. First of all, that wasn't my intent. And second of all, it wasn't. I was just using it in the colloquial sense of the word, And so like you come up with all these different explanations of why I just made an ableist comment, right? Instead of simply apologizing, correcting myself, saying I'll look it up and I'll read more into it. Thank you for letting me know. Thank you for informing me. Instead of saying all of that and moving on with the conversation, maybe in that moment, I get all defensive and want to prove that I'm not an ableist person, right? So the microaggressed person is unfairly disadvantaged in their capacity to convey to others their experience of being microaggressed because a lack of shared resources that would help others understand their experiences as such. Right?
Okay, so here's the thing. I'm going to butt in and I'm going to ask. So what you're basically saying is, if I was in a room in a board meeting and there was another person of color, okay?
Ooh.
Okay.
I know where you're going.
Okay. And this incident happens where someone says, well, which has happened, by the way, in meetings that I've been
to. Yes, has happened. Definitely has happened.
Where how international students are talked about, and I feel like saying, oh my God, and I do say it, well, maybe we need to re-examine what's being said. And then there's another person of color who hasn't said anything. and who actually goes the other way and says, yeah, we really do need to do something, about maybe it's about doing specific interventions for these students and that feeds into the narrative of these students. Yeah, they are coming. It's a deficit lens. These students need help. And so here you have what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is who embodies that epistemic knowledge to make that claim that this was a microaggressive act. Because we see this now where, oh, I'm going to borrow Keela and Jordan's, clip of there can be only one Black person in this room or one brown person in this room. And it gets so complicated when you are saying this was an act of microaggression and you need to look at it. Where do we go from there?
Okay, this is an excellent question. There are kind of several parts to it. On one level, I just want to talk about like people who belong to the same marginalized groups making claims that kind of undercut the reality of another person from that same marginalized group. And I've also seen stuff like this happen all the time. Maybe I've committed acts like that myself. I don't know, right? But I see this kind of stuff happen all the time. We had like this huge, well, this is being recorded, but like, I guess I'll try to be vague. We had like this thing that was massive, and like a ton of students spoke up about their experiences with microaggression, and then and they were all Black students talking about their experiences. Then this adult Black man stands up and then says, well, stuff like this has never happened to me. I've always been very welcome. I've always felt very welcome in this community, and so on and so forth. And we were all just like, what? And this person was very well respected. And we were just like, what just happened? He basically undid the testimony of like, we got 10 students to volunteer, share their experiences, put themselves out there, and this person just undercut their testimony. Now he can say, I'm simply relaying my experiences just as these 10 students relay their experiences. And that is true. You are only relaying your own experiences. You're not saying those students are telling lies. You're not saying that. But you have to recognize the dynamics within that physical space in that moment. That you as a person of color, or you as a person with disability, or you as another trans person, or you, whatever that marginalized identity is that was just spoken about, are going to be given token credibility. You're going to be given credibility, epistemic credibility, because of the identity that you occupy. And you're going to be given more credibility than all those 10 students put together, because the narrative that you say fits into the dominant narratives that we are not oppressors.
Right. Okay.
Right? So yeah. So I mean, the example that obviously comes to my head is Islamophobia. For my own self, is Islamophobia. You have not a lot, but you do have a lot on TV, like overly representative people who go on TV and talk about like how Muslims are barbaric. You have your Irshad Manjis, and I think it's Ian Hershey Ali. You have your folks that are given platforms precisely because,
like Ben Carson, or
yes, who want to talk about how their communities have done themselves into this situation, and that's why they're in this situation, right? And the only reasons that they get the microphone and we don't is because it fits into particular narratives, and we want to surround ourselves by those narratives because they don't shake our epistemic worldview, because they help us retain our epistemic certainty.
Okay, so coming back to secondary microaggressions. So this is so complicated, because you're saying basically it depends on that act depends on the presence of people who are there in that room, whether they deny it, whether they affirm that. So is that what it is?
No, 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 no. I mean, yes, in part, but not entirely. Like, because now, like, we're talking over Zoom, and hopefully we will have, I hope, time for to ask questions and stuff. So we'll talk together, right? We're all in different places. I don't even know where everybody's talking from, right? But we're all in one space, and we're gonna pool in our epistemic resources to talk about our lives and so on and so forth, right? But but what I'm trying to say is that when an incident of microaggression is relayed to another person, there's a world constructed between the confidant, the person that I'm telling that. So, like I just told you a couple of incidences, right now there is a world that is co-constructed between us and me, the microaggressed in that moment, right? And that builds a subjectivity, this communication between us, which is not in the same physical space, and it's much after the fact, right? Is building this subjectivity together where we're co-constructing this world and making sense of how the microaggressed person themselves view their own experiences, right? And this subjectivity isn't formed in some kind of vacuum. It relies on us as members of marginalized groups to make sense of our experiences within the narratives, within the societal narratives that we're already familiar with. And for example, like there are women in this in the Zoom get together, right?
Yeah.
And we are similarly situated in some aspects. Now, we are dissimilarly situated in other aspects. Like, some of us are white, some of us are people of color, some of us are black, which is a very different reality than non-black people of color. Some of us are able-bodied, some of us are people with disabilities. Some of us might be trans women, other people might be cis women. All of those dynamics impact the kind of narratives that we're surrounded by. And but hopefully, when I talk about a microaggressive comment that women generally receive, we are all sort of familiar with certain narratives because we are women.
Right.
So I don't know, like, comments on my looks by my students, or comments on um, comments on my intelligence, or comments on how, like, I might be like, I'm like, I gesticulate when I talk and all this stuff, and somebody might say, like, she's super hyper and she's super blah blah blah. But when a male professor does it, they might say, like, they're very passionate about the topic that they teach about, right? Things of that nature. And all women can, like, sort of nod their head and be like, yeah, we receive evaluations like that because those this is the these are the narratives we are familiar with, right? And but if we were to say to somebody who does not get evaluations such as these, they might say, yeah, I get bad evaluations as well. It's not a function of the fact of my gender identity,
Right.
right? So I think the fact that um how much epistemic credibility we allot to someone is contingent on the narratives that are available to us within our social imaginary. And the narratives that are available to us is in part because of the intersections of identity that we occupy, right?
Right. So what you're saying is, when this secondary harm or when this primary act of microaggression happens, the way to counter is to build an epistemic community, right? Like just now you shared this with me that all the people, most of them are women. And if you talk about some incident about based on a woman's experience, most of them will be able to lean into that knowledge fund and say, yeah, I can relate to that. Something like that similar happened to me. So for an epistemic community, firstly explain what an epistemic community is, or however you want to phrase this. This is not my field. But for an epistemic community to form, does it rely on similarities within identities, or can it be across?
It can be across, but most often um, it relies on people that are similarly situated, but it can be a community. So I think it's kind of important to know that um, that you can form and the great thing about the internet is that we can form these epistemic bubbles, and sit and talk with people who are similarly situated, and so I mean, there's a group of academic mothers on Facebook, for example, or there are you know people only post certain content on Twitter that is only visible to other women of color, for example, or other women academics, or there are Facebook groups for people of color, there are Facebook groups for just Asian academics and just Black academics and just Black US academics, or all people of color academics, or only women, and so on and so forth. So and then people will say something in these groups and they say, this happened to me. And most people, like 8 out of 10 comments, 80% of the comments, could be like, we know exactly what you mean. Things like that happen to us. In fact, they'll go ahead and they'll help you form epistemic certainty about what happened to you. Right. And they'll say to you, don't doubt yourself. What happened to you was racist. What happened to you is a microaggression. What happened to you is sexist. What happened to you, it is motivated by what you think it is motivated by. Don't doubt yourself. So they help us form that epistemic certainty. So I think I'll give one more example, and I don't know if this is gonna help, but when you're a junior academic and you write a paper and you submit it to a journal, you get a bunch of commentary back. When you're very junior in your field and you get comments back that say something along the lines that, please hire a proofreader to improve your English in the paper. Or it says, say that again.
Get a native speaker.
Yes, the keyword is get a native speaker to read over your work. Get a native speaker to read over your work. Or it starts questioning the literature that you're working from. And it starts saying things to you like, maybe you should, are you sure you meant to use the word white supremacy? I'm not sure how this relates. I'm not blah, blah, blah. And you're like, it's clear so if you're somebody experienced, it becomes clear to you that the comments that are being said don't have to do with the structure or the arguments that are being made. They have to do with the identity that the reviewer assumed that you were. If they're saying get a native speaker to read over your paper, they assume that you are a non-native speaker somehow, right? Because in a lot of the papers that I write, it's, even if it's blind review, it's very clear that I'm speaking from an immigrant identity, right? And or if somebody challenges you and says, don't use the term white supremacy, it's not really relevant to this, blah blah blah, you know that they're not read up on the literature that that you are working from, and they're not actually an appropriate reviewer. And they start questioning. I mean, there's so many types of reviews that you can get that sort of fit into that structure where it's clear to you as a senior academic that it has something to do with your marginalized identity. When you're a junior academic and you get those comments, you're like, oh my God, I wrote a really bad paper. In fact, I'm terrible at writing papers in my discipline. And I'm going to sit on it for another year and not produce because I'm going to fix it to perfection.
Right.
And you're depressed about it forever, and so on and so forth, right? And so
I find this example quite interesting because it's been interpreted in so many different ways. Now I sit on an editorial board, and so I'm very cautious about the terminology that we use as reviewers, because it's about gatekeeping, and you have to dismantle that. And when I relay that incident I've had that incident where people have very early on said, and it was literally nitpicking every term that I've used, like, oh, are you sure it's parental engagement and not parental this? Or what do you mean white spaces? Is it a country you're referring to? Or is this a country? What do you mean by page PG? Is it PG like tea bags? They've actually said this. So the tone has taken a complete different. I mean, I had one paper where I had like about 300 remarks like that. And it just put me literally out of, I was like, I'm not going to look at this paper. I don't even want to do academia anymore. I'm out of here. And I didn't even look at it for the next 8 months. And then when I came back, I remember you encouraging me to share it with, a community of women of color academics. And the comments that I got at that point in time, it was just so unexpected. They were professors, tenured professors saying, yeah, we get this too. And I was like, what? So, I mean, is that what, like, how does epistemic community form in those instances? And what's the way forward?
Excellent. Yeah. So you just outed yourself. You know that, right?
That's fine. That's fine. I'm happy to share my experiences.
Okay. So in one of my works, one of the papers that's on this is the case study is actually based on Sana's experience. so the case one about the reviewer is actually based on her experience, and I didn't want to use the terms here because I was afraid that you're going to jump in, but then you jumped in, so that's fine. That's good. That's your prerogative. I'm glad you're sharing that. And yes, when you came to me and I said to you, no, Sana, like this is not to do with the quality of your paper. I've read your paper. Your paper looks great. Your paper is doing fine. I mean, might need some restructuring or something, but I don't know. I don't think so from my discipline's perspective. But and then I said, why don't you post it in the group of women of color? And everybody was super supportive, and they said, like, you have a bunch of people who are not very familiar with critical race theory within education. Basically, they're working from like a very wide framework in education, and this is not cool. Like, don't doubt yourself, right? And then you took it back. To you brought it up in some departmental meeting, or some, like, a not departmental meeting, but like in like a collegial meeting, and they all begin to second guess you, and they all begin to say things like, perhaps the reviewer meant this, and are you sure you didn't misread what the reviewer actually said, and so on and so forth. And if you hadn't brought it to like such a vast community of women of color before that, you would have said, I think the reviewer is onto something, and I need to fix my paper better. I need to get a native speaker, and so on and so forth, even though you have been studying in English language from, kindergarten. Like, I mean, people don't get this idea, but like other countries are bilingual, right? So you are studying in English from, from whenever you join school. And so, that actually, yeah, I mean, my daughter, she was like, oh, I want to go to Pakistan so I can improve my Urdu. And then she says, well, the bad part is everybody in Pakistan speaks to me in English. So it doesn't really work. I was like, yeah. So I mean, other countries are bilingual. People are like, oh, you're not a native speaker. No, I'm just maybe not speaking American English per se, or British English per se, but I am an English speaker. And so I think the fact that you were able to bring this to other women of color, form that shared epistemic resource that I was talking about, form that epistemic resource that you needed to feel epistemic certainty that your project was a good one. Because the harms of not believing that your project is the harms of believing that your project is not worthy enough, is that, first of all, we don't get people from our community commenting within our discipline about our own selves. We get other professors who are talking about us, down to us, right? Instead of us theorizing our own lives, right? And our own experiences. So all of a sudden, academia loses out because we are getting claims that are only based in a small subset of the population, a subset that doesn't even have access to the lived experiences of the people that they're talking about, right? Because they're not occupying those social locations. But also, there's the harm to the person who was just microaggressed. Namely, that they don't feel intellectual enough. They feel like quitting academia. They feel down on themselves. They hold on to their paper for 2-3 years, sitting on it forever, not revising it, not submitting it. Hence, their productivity, suffers. And now you don't get reviewed properly. Like, you don't get reviewed favorably when your annual review comes up. And now your tenure is up for question. And are you still on probation? I mean, there's just so many ramifications out of small microaggressive acts that keep happening. And you're like, really? Did one paper do that to you? Is that why you didn't get tenure? Did one paper get you, are you serious? Is that what you... It's not one paper. That's the problem. You keep encountering these acts over and over and over again. And they keep chipping away at the knowledge claims that you make about your own intellectual acumen.
Right. Okay, so I've got lots of questions, but I'm gonna shut up and I'm gonna let Malcolm come in and take questions. So what we're gonna do is, if you've got a question, please put it in the chat box. Please don't worry about the time, because I've booked extra time, because I knew this session is going to be fascinating. Malcolm, can we stop the recording so people are comfortable enough to, come on the mic? Yeah.
Okay, everyone, I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you.